My name's Clara Reddick. I'm 27, a former Army medic from Oregon. I've always loved deep woods and quiet places. After leaving the service, I drifted for a while, working as a fire lookout, joining seasonal trail crews, that sort of thing. Finally, I landed a backcountry ranger job in a quiet national park up near the Canadian border in northern Washington. I thought it would be a fresh start, a place to lose myself in the trees. Maybe I'd find some peace, but I found something else instead. Something people called an animal, but it was more dangerous and terrifying than anything I'd ever seen, even in horror movies. My first week was standard. Radio protocols, terrain orientation, safety drills. I was partnered with a man named Gil, an experienced veteran in his late 50s with the kind of permanent squint that comes from years of staring into the distance. He didn't talk much, didn't like to answer questions, but he knew the park like the back of his hand, and he moved through it like he belonged there in a way I envied. So when a search call came in about 2 overdue hikers during my second week, it made sense that Gil and I would be the ones to check it out. The higher-ups said the pair had been expected back the day before. They hadn't shown. Their intended route cut across a remote section of the park. Vehicles couldn't reach this stretch, just steep, brush-choked ridges and broken terrain. That meant everything we needed had to be carried on our backs. Neither I nor Gil hesitated. This was exactly the kind of work I had hoped for. We packed light, radioed in our direction, and headed in, fully aware we'd likely be out overnight. It felt routine at first, but that was before we found the camp. The 2 hikers had last been seen 3 days ago, heading north past the Thunder Creek Trail spur. They weren't locals, probably underestimated the terrain. By the time HQ flagged it for follow-up, they were already more than a full day late. We drove the first 15 miles down an old, rutted logging road that wound through the foothills like a scar, then pulled over and continued on foot. The trail was too narrow and steep for even a dirt bike to make it up. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed into brush-choked switchbacks. These were the kind where sound gets swallowed by the trees. Gil walked ahead with quiet intensity. His eyes constantly swept the trail and the tree line. That kind of alertness comes from experience, not paranoia. About 20 minutes into the hike, he came to an abrupt stop. I nearly bumped into him. He was crouching low, staring at something in the soft dirt beside the trail. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer, just continued staring, slowly shaking his head. I stepped around him to see what he had found. A partial footprint, oddly shaped, too wide for a boot, with elongated toe impressions. Not quite barefoot, not quite animal either. "Is that human?" I asked, lowering myself for a better look. "Or maybe a bear's front paw." Gil remained crouched, unmoving, gaze locked on the print. Then, without a word, he stood up, unslung the rifle from his shoulder, and continued walking, not faster, not slower, but with the weapon held ready in both hands. Something about the way he moved after that. It told me he wasn't just expecting trouble. He was certain of it. This struck me as odd. This was a national park, open to the public. It wasn't particularly popular, but I hadn't read of any bear attacks or other incidents when I looked it up on Google before my interview, nor did they mention anything during the induction. We found the campsite just before dusk, about 4 miles from where we'd left the truck. I froze as soon as I saw it. The place looked like a tornado had hit. Tents were shredded, seams hanging off broken poles. One tent was half collapsed, a sleeping bag spilling out as though someone had run off in the middle of the night. Gear was everywhere, an overturned cook stove, ripped open backpacks, food wrappers blowing in the wind. A single boot still sat zipped inside a tent vestibule, as if its owner had vanished mid-step. The whole clearing felt wrong. It was as if something terrible had happened. The fire ring held only a shallow pile of barely burned coals. It looked like the fire had died long before the panic started. But there was no blood, no bodies, no drag marks. I crouched near the fire, running my fingers over the half-charred logs. "This went out a while ago," I said. "Not even embers left." Gil stood near one of the tents, staring at a long gouge in the canvas. "Claws," he muttered. "Bear?" I asked. He nodded, but too slowly. Yeah. Most likely I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. He just paced a slow circle around the site, eyes scanning everything, shoulders tight. When I pointed out the absence of blood, he shrugged. Could have run. Panicked when they saw the bear. Got lost in the dark. After a long moment, he gestured toward the fire ring. That was their mistake, he said. You're out this far. You don't screw around with a little campfire. You keep it high. Keep it hot. Big flame scares them off. He said it so naturally, so casually, that I almost didn't catch it. Scares what off? I asked. Gil looked at me. Not surprised, just tired. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, few one, he said flatly. What else? He kicked some dirt onto the fire ring and shouldered his pack. We'll stay here tonight, build a big fire. Maybe the hikers are still out there somewhere, and the fire will guide them to us. Is it safe to stay here? I asked, glancing toward the wreckage of the nearby tents. I mean, if this was a bear attack, should we really be camping this close? Gil didn't even flinch. We don't have a choice, Wissel, he said. Matter of fact, it's almost dark. We're not going to make it back down the trail before nightfall in this difficult terrain. I opened my mouth to argue, but he added, It'll be okay. We've got the rifle. I'll build a real fire, big enough to keep away anything. Then he turned toward the brush and began gathering wood. We made camp less than 100 yards from the destroyed site. Gil did indeed build a massive fire, feeding it with deadfall until it burst into flames and roared. Easily the biggest campfire I'd ever seen. He didn't say much after that, just kept piling up wood and then settled down, cleaning his rifle in silence while the forest pressed in all around us. Later, lying in my tent, I couldn't stop thinking about how strange Gil had acted. The way he stared at that footprint, how quickly he grabbed his rifle, the tension in his shoulders. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ruined campsite and those torn tents. I kept picturing someone running barefoot into the forest in the middle of the night, so scared they forgot their boots. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept checking the firelight flickering on my tent walls, just to make sure it was still burning high. I barely slept, and when I did, it was only in short, restless bursts. I must have dozed off for a while, because the next thing I remember is waking to a soft, rhythmic crunching sound outside. My watch said 3:42 a.m. The fire was still burning, although not quite as high as before, but it was still formidable. Beneath the constant crackling of the flames, I could just make out other noises, soft, deliberate sounds that didn't belong to the wind or settling branches. Footfalls, maybe. The faint brushing of something heavy against the undergrowth. My heart picked up speed as I strained to listen, hardly breathing, trying to verify that I wasn't just imagining things. I wasn't. Something was moving around the camp, something big. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but then I heard it exhale, long, measured, almost thoughtful, the kind of breath you take when you're studying something. Its steps fainted slightly, then came closer again. The noises were coming from my left. It must have been circling Gil's tent. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, listening to the soft scrape of claws on canvas. The intruder seemed to be investigating Gil's tent with its paws. I could hear Gil snoring loudly, completely unaware of what was happening. Once again, I recalled the strange footprints we saw that afternoon. I couldn't pinpoint it, but something about this whole situation felt terribly wrong. The hairs on my neck stood up, as if my body was reacting instinctively to a primal fear I could not yet name. Then, within a heartbeat, all hell broke loose. There was a thud, like something had thrown its full weight against Gil's tent, loud enough to shake the ground beneath me. The sound cracked through the stillness like a gunshot. Then came the rip of fabric, violent and fast, followed by a choked, panicked yell from inside. Gil screamed, a scream more frantic and terrified than anything I'd ever heard. The man was clearly scared for his life. Then came the curses, broken, frantic, and another scream, higher pitched, ragged. Then something growled. It was a sound so deep it made my molars ache. Not the defensive snarl of a bear, or the distinct growl of a large dog or wolf. It was the kind of sound that makes your instincts recoil before your brain can catch up. Then I could hear limbs flailing, the collapse of gear, the sharp ting of metal scraping against bone or claw, and suddenly I was moving, barefoot, shaking, grabbing my flashlight and bear spray like a child clutching toys in a storm. What I saw when I got out of my tent stopped me cold. Gil's tent had collapsed inward and was convulsing violently. I couldn't see him at all. Not a hand, not a foot, but the back half of something huge was sticking out from the ruined canvas, unmistakably alive and horribly wrong. Thick, dark, oily fur shimmered in the glow of the fire, slick with either rain or blood. For the most part, its legs looked human, thighs, knees, calves, but further down, they were bent in an unnatural, digitigrade posture, like a canine walking on its haunches. Clawed toes raked the earth as it shifted and pushed its body further into the collapsed tent, its heavy frame swaying with barely controlled force. The front half of the thing was inside the tent, with Gil. I didn't want to imagine what was happening in there, or even what the rest of that creature looked like, but the sound of Gil's choked screams snapped me out of my trance. My eyes darted to the fire pit. Without thinking, I lunged toward it and grabbed a thick piece of split log that hadn't fully burned. One end was still glowing orange, smoldering from the heat. Gripping it like a crude torch, I rushed forward with a yell I barely recognized as my own and slammed the burning end into the creature's thigh. The smell was awful, scorched hair and something sickly, almost sweet. The beast let out a shriek. Not a howl, not a growl, but something jagged and human-shaped in its agony. Its body twisted violently, tearing more of the tent with it as it thrashed to get away from the searing heat pressed into its flesh. I stumbled back, the log still clutched in my shaking hands, heart hammering so hard I could barely hear over the ringing in my ears. The creature recoiled, crawling backward out of the collapsed tent in a clumsy lurch, its shoulders heaving. For a split second, I thought it might retreat, but then it turned to face me. Its full shape was visible now. One massive hand still clutched Gil's ankle, half dragging him through shredded nylon and leaves. The beast's head was wolf-like but somehow deformed, too broad, too expressive, with matted fur clinging to its angular skull. Its mouth opened in a low, thunderous growl, and it bared a mouthful of long, yellowed teeth. It flattened its ears like an angry dog preparing to lunge. The noise it made next was primal and full of threat, and I felt the pressure of it in my chest like a subwoofer. Every part of me wanted to run, to bolt into the woods and not stop until morning. But I couldn't leave Gil behind. Maybe it was my army training, or just something inside me that wouldn't let me abandon him. I forced down the panic, stepped forward, and switched my flashlight to high beam. It wasn't just any flashlight. It was a tactical model, one I'd used during night SAR training. Waterproof, shockproof, and bright enough to light up a mountainside. I'd brought it out of habit, thinking I'd only need it for trail navigation or disoriented hikers. But now, the focused beam cut through the dark like a blade. The beam hit the creature square in the eyes. It recoiled instantly, snarling and raising its other clawed hand to shield its face. That was my opening. I ducked down and let loose the bear spray in a tight arc, aiming from a low angle and hitting it directly across the snout and eyes. The effect was immediate. The beast let out a wet, choking snarl and reeled sideways, thrashing its head and raking its claws blindly through the air. Its grip on Gil's ankle loosened, then released completely as it retreated in pain. With both arms free, the creature began pawing at its face in a wild frenzy, clawing at its snout and eyes with the desperation of an animal set on fire. The yelps turned into screams, raw and distorted, echoing through the trees like something ancient and wrong. I could smell the acrid stench of chemicals mixing with the foul musk radiating off its body, thick enough to make my own eyes water and my stomach turn. With the creature momentarily blinded and writhing, Gil seized his chance. I saw him twist, bloody and half-conscious, dragging himself deeper into the collapsed wreckage of his tent. His movements were jerky and desperate, half crawling, half tunneling through the shredded fabric and scattered gear. He vanished from view for a few agonizing seconds as the beast thrashed and wheezed. I stood frozen with the bear spray canister raised, ready to blast it again if it turned toward me, but it didn't. It was still trying to rid itself of the bear spray. Then I heard it, the subtle click of a rifle bolt being chambered. Gil emerged from the collapsed mess, pale and soaked with blood, dragging his left leg behind him. But in his hands, he held the hunting rifle, a solid .30-06 with a short scope and a weather-worn stock. He pulled it up to his chest, hands trembling, and forced himself to steady his aim. Every movement looked painful, but he gritted his teeth, sucked in a ragged breath, and fixed the barrel on the creature's chest with grim determination. "Clara!" he shouted, voice raw. "Move!" I ducked just as the rifle roared. The shot echoed like thunder through the trees, the recoil knocking Gil half back into the tent. The creature was still thrashing wildly, and the round struck it high in the shoulder rather than hitting anything vital. But the impact was still enough to send it staggering backward. It let out a strangled cry and tumbled to the ground, landing hard on its side with a spray of dirt and fallen leaves. The beast let out a shriek, high-pitched, shrill, almost woman-like, and then scrambled back on its four long limbs in a feral panic. Blood still oozed from its shoulder, but it moved with terrifying speed, faster than anything that size had any right to. It bolted off to the side and crashed into the underbrush on all fours, vanishing into the darkness with branches snapping in its wake. Gil fumbled with the bolt, trying to chamber another round while still shaking, but by the time he got it ready, the creature was already gone, swallowed up by the trees. He didn't even get a chance to aim again. For a few heartbeats, there was only silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you question what just happened. Then the howl came again. It started low and somewhat wolf-like, then rose into something deep and mournful, filled with rage and pain. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the valley, echoing off the cliffs like some ancient death chant. I shivered, not from cold, but from the certainty that we weren't out of danger yet. I ran to Gil. He was conscious, but clearly in pain. Blood soaked through the side of his shirt. Yes, but it was his lower legs that were the worst. Deep gouges and puncture wounds oozing fresh red where the creature had dragged and clawed him. His pants were shredded, his boots nearly torn off. He sat upright with effort, jaw clenched against the pain, face slick with sweat. His hands were shaking, but he was still gripping the rifle, finger hovering near the trigger guard. "You got it," I said, kneeling beside him, trying to assess the wounds, my military training overriding the adrenaline. Gil didn't answer at first. He just stared out into the trees, chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. His eyes weren't wide with fear. Not exactly. More like fury. A deep, seething anger that simmered beneath his exhaustion. I looked at him, but he didn't meet my gaze. Just kept staring into the black between the trees, like he expected the beast to return any second. The fire crackled behind us, casting long shadows, and I realized I was still clutching the bear spray in my hand. Neither of us felt like sleeping. After the attack, everything felt like it was being held together by a thread. Gil sat hunched near the fire, rifle across his lap, blood-soaked gauze pressed to his leg, jaw locked in a grim expression. He hadn't said a word since the creature vanished into the woods. I could hear the effort in his breathing, each inhale a controlled hiss through clenched teeth. I wanted to keep moving, to get the hell out of there, but he shook his head the moment I brought it up. "We won't make it in the dark," he said. "Not with that thing out there. It'd be on us the moment we leave the fire." I hesitated. The trail was long, rough, and steep in places. Gil could barely stand without groaning, let alone walk several miles. He was right. Even if we tried, we'd be hobbling in the dark with one good flashlight, half a can of bear spray, and a useless rifle that had no night vision scope. If that thing came back, it would rip us apart in seconds. So we stayed. We rebuilt the fire first, Gil had taught me how to build one that would burn through the night during my first week on the job. But this time he gave extra instructions, voice tight with urgency. We gathered dry, thick logs, bark, and kindling, and fed them until the flames roared up nearly shoulder-high. The heat blasted back from the pit in waves, drying the sweat and blood on my arms. It didn't feel safe, not really, but it was the closest thing we had to a safe haven. We sat there for a while, just watching the fire. I was still trying to come down from the adrenaline, trying to process what had just happened. My mind kept flashing to that moment when I saw the full shape of the thing, its eyes, its posture, the way it moved. My knuckles were white on the bear spray canister, which I hadn't put down since the attack. Gil pulled a small silver flask from his jacket, unscrewed the cap, and took a long pull, then another. He didn't offer it to me, and I didn't ask for it. "What about the missing hikers?" I asked after a while. My voice sounded dry. "We should try to find them in the morning. Maybe they got away." Gil didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire like he could see something inside it that I couldn't. "They're gone," he said flatly. "Whatever that thing is, it doesn't leave people behind. They're probably up in a tree somewhere by now, dragged off into the forest and tucked away until it decides to feed. That thing wasn't hunting for sport. It was harvesting." His words landed like a punch to the chest. I looked at him hard. "Then what the hell was it? That wasn't a bear or a wolf. You've seen one before, haven't you?" He took another drink, eyes still locked on the flames. "Yeah," he said. "Long time ago, but yeah." He let the silence stretch again. I didn't push, just waited. Eventually the fire cracked, and he sighed like he'd been holding something in for too long. "There's a place, he said slowly, deeper in the woods, close to the Canadian border. No one talks about it. It's been there since the 60s, maybe longer. Used to be military, Cold War era. Then it got handed off. Now it's private. Some contractor. Quiet. Well-funded. You won't find it on Google or on any map." He paused to shift his leg and winced. "Back in the 80s, when I was still new, something got out. Big. They said it was some kind of bear hybrid at the time, a rogue test animal, but it wasn't. Thing tore through a team of rangers, killed 3, left another 2 in pieces the next day. I didn't see it happen, but I was sent in after, with the cleanup crew." I stared at him. "What did you see?" He looked at me then finally. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed in smoke and exhaustion. Shredded tents, mangled rifles, blood smeared on tree trunks 8 feet high. And then there were the howls, twisted, almost human in a way. Weirdest thing I've ever heard, until last night. Whatever it was, its behavior didn't quite make sense. It was fast and strong, but also somewhat erratic. Confused, broken, didn't know what it was doing half the time. It ran from fire, wouldn't go near it. They cornered it near an old lookout and herded it using burning brush and noise, caught it in a steel crate, and airlifted it out of the forest. He stopped, as if weighing whether or not to continue. "There was a guy there," he added. "A young civilian. Scientist, I think. Didn't wear a uniform or a weapon. He kept telling everyone not to hurt it. Said they were rare. Said they were hard to find. Like he wasn't afraid of it. Just disappointed that it had gotten away." The fire popped, and I felt goosebumps crawl up my arms. Gil took another drink, then stared into the woods. "But tonight, that wasn't the same thing." I narrowed my eyes. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "That one we just saw?" It was stronger, faster. Avoided the fire but came into the camp nonetheless. "Even after you've burned it, it kept coming. You saw it." I nodded slowly. "It looked different too," he said. "It moved like it had done this before. It wasn't confused. It picked a target, me, and went for the kill, like it had a plan." A cold weight settled in my chest. "You think it's newer? Like they made improvements to whatever they had caught in the 80s? Gil didn't answer, just stared out into the dark. "I think they've been refining it," he said finally. "I think whatever they started back during the Cold War never stopped. And what we saw tonight? That's what comes after decades of trial and error. That was a version that worked better." He shifted slightly, wincing as he adjusted his weight. "The first one, The thing I saw back in the 80s, it was twisted, unstable. Its limbs didn't match. The spine looked warped, like it had been forced to adapt to a shape it wasn't built for. It moved awkwardly. Still dangerous, sure, but you could tell it wasn't viable. His gaze was flat now, voice low and steady. But this one? Its body made more sense. The limbs were strong and symmetrical. The way it ran, the way it leapt, all of it was fluid, almost elegant. The spine looked clean, strong. It was more than just dangerous. It was built right, adapted to think, run, fight, and kill. He paused, and I realized he wasn't just afraid. He was angry. Someone's still working on them, he said. And now they've got a version that is much more deadly, and it's gotten out. He looked at me for a long time. I didn't know what to say. Gil leaned forward, poked at the fire with a stick, then looked back at me with a tired, bitter smile. They're not animals, Clara. I think they were people. Once. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. We both sat there in silence, the fire crackling loudly between us. At one point, we heard something in the trees, a soft groan, or distant moan, maybe an animal, maybe not. Then a few howls, a few 100 yards away, curling up over the ridge and echoing down through the valley. But it didn't come closer. Gil took another slow sip from his flask. After the last incident, he said, his voice quieter now, they gave us all big raises, the ones who signed the paperwork anyway. NDAs. None of it ever made the news, not even a whisper. They hired lawyers, paid off families, and rewrote the official logs. A couple of us quit. Others, like myself, stayed quiet and kept cashing checks. He looked at me like he was sizing me up. It'll be the same this time. Either they'll pay us for our silence, or they won't even care. With all the crap and fake news out there, who'd believe us if we said we got attacked by a wolf man? No one's ever going to know what happened out here, even if it mauls another 20 people before they catch it. They might not even want to catch it. For all I know, they've let that thing out on purpose to see how fares out in the wild. Whoever ends up in its claws is just collateral damage, unavoidable. That's just how these things work. I didn't respond. My mouth was dry. The fire crackled and popped. Gil turned back to the trees. We stayed awake till dawn. Neither of us said another word. The morning came slowly. Neither of us had slept for even a second after the attack. We just sat by the fire through the night, listening, waiting. Every time the wind rustled the underbrush or a bird chirped out of turn, I flinched. Gil kept the rifle on his lap the entire time, his eyes never leaving the tree line. By the time the first hint of light touched the sky, we must have gone through 200 or 300 pounds of firewood, but we were alive. Gil winced as he stood, his whole body stiff and battered. I helped him pack the remaining gear. His gait was uneven, favoring his right leg. The left was gouged badly, wrapped in layers of gauze that were already soaking through with fresh blood. He didn't complain, just gritted his teeth and kept moving. The hike back was brutal. We didn't say a word. Every step felt like a test, of silence, of endurance, of waiting to see if something would come crashing out of the woods behind us. But nothing happened. The trail stayed empty. The woods were quiet. The air had that early morning stillness, too quiet, too clean. It felt like a calm we hadn't earned. We reached the truck around mid-morning, the gravel lot looking exactly as we'd left it, completely untouched. No tracks, no signs of visitors. After what Gil had told me, I half expected to find the vehicle destroyed by the creature, which would have trapped us out here. Gil tossed his pack in the bed and leaned against the tailgate, breathing hard. The last one was nocturnal, he muttered. Seems like this is still the case. That's the only reason we made it out. I didn't ask for clarification. Back at HQ, I typed up a field report. Dry, clinical, no mention of the attack. Just notes about the missing hikers, the damaged campsite, and the failed overnight search. Gil didn't file anything. He just limped into the supervisor's office, said a few quiet words, and walked out. We didn't debrief. No one asked questions. I took emergency leave that afternoon. By the time I got back to my apartment in Bellingham, everything felt surreal. I dropped my pack at the door, peeled off my dirty clothes, and stood in the shower until the water ran cold. My brain kept playing it over. Gil's screams, that horrible face. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing that thing right in front of me. The next morning, an envelope arrived via private courier. It wasn't from the park service. Inside was a formal letter, an offer, a new post, Olympic National Park, permanent position, substantially better pay, housing provided, full benefits, and an NDA, a thick one. I read it 3 times. Buried in the legal language were terms I couldn't ignore. Confidentiality in perpetuity, no disclosure of field incidents, internal communication, or field partner conduct. Violation meant immediate termination and legal action. There was a pen included in the envelope, gold-trimmed, like they expected me to sign without hesitation. I sat there for a long time, staring at it. The pen felt heavier than it should have. I hadn't told anyone what happened yet, but someone already knew. Someone had moved fast. Eventually, I signed. What else was I supposed to do? Refuse and wind up in some dark cell or worse? I signed because they'd already made the decision for me. I signed because I didn't want to disappear. And yet, here I am, typing it all up anyway.